In the shadowed streets of New York, where power was measured not in votes or public praise, but in silence, loyalty, and fear, one name carried a weight that few dared to speak too loudly: Anthony Gaspipe Casso. He was not a flashy celebrity gangster seeking headlines, nor a polished public figure pretending to be legitimate. Instead, he operated in the darker layers of organized crime, where authority was enforced through whispers, coded messages, and the cold certainty of violence. For years, his reputation alone was enough to shift the mood of a room. Associates lowered their voices when discussing him, rivals reconsidered their ambitions, and even allies understood that survival often depended on unquestioning obedience. The story of Anthony Casso is not simply the story of a criminal figure rising through the ranks of the Lucchese crime family. It is a story of how fear can become both a weapon and a weakness, how power built on intimidation can create loyalty but also isolation, and how a man who once seemed untouchable ultimately found himself trapped by the very system he helped strengthen. To understand his ascent, it is important to understand the world he entered. Organized crime in New York was structured, hierarchical, and deeply rooted in tradition. Families operated with rules, codes of conduct, and strict chains of command. Advancement required more than aggression. It required patience, alliances, and proof of loyalty. Casso emerged from this environment with a reputation for efficiency and ruthlessness. From early on, he demonstrated a willingness to carry out orders without hesitation, a trait that superiors valued in a system where discipline was everything. His nickname, Gaspipe, became part of his identity, a label that followed him as he climbed higher within the organization. Over time, he proved himself not only as someone capable of enforcing decisions, but also as someone who understood the mechanics of power. He cultivated relationships strategically, aligning himself with influential figures and positioning himself as indispensable. In the world of the Lucchese crime family, influence was earned through results. Prosecutors would later allege that Casso ordered and participated in numerous acts of violence to protect the family's interests and secure his own authority. Within the organization, these actions were interpreted as strength. Rivals were removed, internal dissent was silenced, and the message was clear: defiance carried consequences. As his standing grew, so did his influence over operations. He became deeply involved in managing crews, overseeing illicit enterprises, and ensuring that revenue streams remained steady. But what truly distinguished Casso was not just his ability to generate profit. It was his reliance on fear as a management strategy. Loyalty tests were not symbolic gestures, but serious demonstrations of commitment. Associates were expected to prove themselves repeatedly, and suspicion was never far from the surface. In a world already shaped by secrecy, Casso intensified the atmosphere. Those beneath him understood that trust was conditional and could be withdrawn at any moment. For a time, this approach appeared effective. His authority seemed firm, his network disciplined, and his reputation formidable. The Lucchese crime family benefited from his assertive enforcement style, at least in the short term. Violence, while risky, served as a deterrent. Competitors hesitated before encroaching on territory, and internal disputes were settled swiftly. Yet the same environment that allowed Casso to rise also planted the seeds of instability. Organized crime families depended not only on fear, but also on cohesion. Mutual trust, even among criminals, was essential for survival. As investigations by law enforcement agencies intensified during this era, pressure mounted across New York's underworld. Surveillance increased, informants became more common, and federal prosecutors pursued organized crime figures with renewed determination. In this climate, paranoia spread easily. For someone like Casso, whose leadership style already leaned heavily on suspicion, the growing scrutiny reinforced his worst instincts. He began to see threats not only from outside forces, but also from within. Allegiances that once seemed secure appeared fragile. Associates who had served loyally for years were suddenly viewed as potential informants. The line between caution and obsession began to blur. According to prosecutors, the number of murders attributed to his orders reflected not just strategic eliminations of rivals, but also reactions to perceived betrayal. Each act of violence may have strengthened his immediate control, but also narrowed his circle of trust. Fear can command obedience, but it rarely inspires genuine loyalty. Over time, the structure around him grew rigid and brittle. Those who remained close did so out of necessity rather than devotion. Meanwhile, law enforcement continued building cases, flipping insiders, and gathering evidence. The larger context of organized crime in New York was shifting. High-profile prosecutions demonstrated that even powerful figures could be brought down. The old code of silence, once nearly unbreakable, showed cracks as some members chose cooperation over lengthy prison sentences. For a leader who depended on absolute control, this changing landscape posed a profound challenge. Casso's authority had been constructed through dominance and intimidation, but the legal system operated by different rules. Courtrooms did not respond to fear in the same way as street corners or backroom meetings. As pressure mounted, his attempts to maintain control reportedly became more aggressive. The climate within his circle tightened and suspicion deepened. What had once been a tool for consolidating power began to erode stability. In many ways, his story illustrates a central paradox of violent leadership within criminal organizations. Ruthlessness can accelerate a rise to prominence, especially in environments where strength is prized. However, the same ruthlessness can generate an atmosphere of perpetual insecurity. When everyone is afraid, no one truly feels safe, including the leader. The Lucchese crime family, like other organized crime groups, relied on a balance between enforcement and cooperation. Disrupt that balance too severely, and the structure begins to strain. Casso's early success was undeniable. He navigated the complex hierarchy, demonstrated unwavering commitment to the organization's goals, and eliminated obstacles with decisive force. For a time, he appeared to embody the qualities that the underworld rewarded. Yet beneath the surface, the cost of his methods accumulated. Trust diminished. Alliances weakened. The constant need to monitor, test, and threaten created fatigue and resentment. At the same time, federal investigations were becoming more sophisticated. Wiretaps, surveillance operations, and coordinated task forces targeted organized crime with unprecedented intensity. The era when mafia families could operate with relative impunity was fading. Leaders who had once seemed insulated found themselves exposed. Casso's response to this evolving threat environment reportedly involved doubling down on control. Instead of easing internal tensions, he reinforced them. Instead of building broader consensus, he tightened his grip. Such strategies can produce short-term compliance, but often undermine long-term resilience. As we examine the rise of Anthony Gaspipe Casso, it becomes clear that his ascent was fueled by a combination of ambition, strategic alignment, and calculated violence. He understood the language of power within his world and spoke it fluently. He proved himself useful to superiors and intimidating to adversaries. He embraced a model of leadership that prioritized dominance above all else. However, the very intensity that propelled him upward also cast long shadows. In environments defined by secrecy and illegality, stability depends on fragile bonds. Once suspicion becomes a dominant force, those bonds fray quickly. Casso's reputation as a ruthless enforcer solidified his place near the top of the Lucchese crime family, but also isolated him. As law enforcement closed in and the culture of silence weakened, the system he had helped fortify began to shift. The seeds of his eventual fall were planted during the height of his power, embedded in the methods he chose and the atmosphere he cultivated. His story serves as a stark reminder that in the world of organized crime, strength and vulnerability often coexist. The same fear that silences opposition can also silence honest counsel. The same violence that eliminates rivals can erode unity. Anthony Casso's rise was dramatic, marked by influence and infamy, but unfolded within a volatile ecosystem where every action carried consequences. Understanding this rise is essential to understanding what would later unravel, because the foundations of authority were never as unshakable as they appeared. As Anthony Gaspipe, Casso's authority expanded within the Lucchese crime family. The environment around him grew increasingly tense, shaped by a mixture of ambition, loyalty, calculation, and fear. His position was no longer that of a rising figure proving himself. He had become a central force within the organization's operations, someone whose approval could determine careers and whose suspicion could end them. Power at that level required constant maintenance. It was not enough to eliminate a rival once or to enforce discipline occasionally. The system demanded ongoing vigilance, continuous demonstrations of strength, and an unwavering posture of control. Casso embraced this reality fully. His leadership style hardened as he moved higher, and the circle around him became more tightly controlled. Associates were expected to follow instructions without hesitation, and those who hesitated risked being labeled unreliable. In criminal organizations, labels carry weight, and the perception of weakness can be fatal. By reinforcing a culture where doubt was dangerous and obedience was survival, Casso reinforced his dominance, but also deepened the sense of unease that surrounded him. Prosecutors would later describe a pattern in which violence became a routine instrument, rather than a last resort. Murders were allegedly ordered not only to settle external disputes, but also to address internal suspicions. Each act sent a message that control will be maintained at any cost. Within the short-term framework of organized crime, such decisiveness could be effective. Rivals were silenced, and those considering betrayal were reminded of the consequences. Yet every escalation raised the stakes. Law enforcement agencies were intensifying their focus on organized crime across New York. Coordinated investigations targeted the financial structures and leadership hierarchies of the major families. Surveillance operations became more advanced, and federal prosecutors increasingly relied on conspiracy statutes that allowed them to build broad cases encompassing multiple acts and participants. The more violence that occurred, the more attention the organization attracted. Casso's approach, centered on intimidation and strict internal control, inadvertently amplified that attention. Fear kept many silent, but it could not shield the organization from wiretaps, informants, or undercover operations. As pressure increased from the outside, pressure increased within. Suspicion became a constant undercurrent. Associates wondered who might be cooperating with authorities. Leaders worried about leaks. In such a climate, paranoia can thrive. For Casso, whose leadership already leaned toward distrust, the growing investigations validated his harsh instincts. He reportedly believed that betrayal was not just possible but inevitable, and that preemptive action was the safest course. This mindset intensified internal purges. Loyalty tests became more severe, and rumors carried dangerous weight. In criminal networks, perception often becomes reality. If enough people believe that betrayal is widespread, behavior shifts accordingly. Communication becomes guarded, alliances become fragile, and even long-standing relationships can fracture. Casso's reliance on fear ensured compliance, but also discouraged honest communication. Subordinates were less likely to share concerns or question strategies, even if those strategies increased risk. A leader who inspires fear may command obedience, but he also risks isolating himself from valuable information. At the same time, the broader landscape of organized crime was evolving. Several high-profile prosecutions demonstrated that long prison sentences were no longer rare exceptions. The era when leaders could assume relative insulation from legal consequences was fading. Cooperation agreements with federal authorities offer reduced sentences to those willing to testify, creating powerful incentives to break the traditional code of silence. This shift represented a structural threat to organizations like the Lucchese crime family. Loyalty based solely on fear becomes unstable when alternatives emerge. If an associate faces decades behind bars, fear of a superior may begin to compete with fear of prison. Casso's model control did not easily accommodate this new reality. His instinct was to tighten discipline rather than adapt. As investigations moved closer to senior leadership, the atmosphere reportedly became more volatile. Decisions were scrutinized internally, and suspicion fell on individuals who had once been trusted. In such circumstances, the very mechanisms designed to protect the organization can begin to weaken it. The constant emphasis on identifying traitors can create them, as individuals seek self-preservation in an environment where trust has eroded. Casso's story during this period reflects the paradox of dominance. The more he sought to eliminate uncertainty through force, the more uncertainty seemed to multiply. Allegations mounted that he ordered additional killings to address perceived threats. Each act reinforced his image as a ruthless enforcer, but also narrowed his support base. Fear can bind people together temporarily, yet it rarely builds durable alliances. Meanwhile, prosecutors were compiling evidence methodically, testimony from cooperating witnesses, surveillance records, and financial documentation gradually constructed a detailed picture of the organization's operations. As cases developed, indictments followed. Arrests disrupted routines and signaled that the legal net was tightening. Within the family, anxiety grew. The realization that the government possessed substantial information altered calculations. Some members began to reassess their loyalty. The once rigid code of silence showed signs of strain. For a leader who relied on absolute control, this environment was destabilizing. Casso reportedly responded by reinforcing his authority, emphasizing loyalty and condemning any hint of cooperation. However, condemnation alone could not reverse the structural pressures at work. The justice system's leverage was significant, and the prospect of lengthy sentences changed incentives. The organization faced not only external prosecution, but also internal fragmentation. In analyzing this phase of Casso's life, it becomes evident that the seeds of collapse were intertwined with the very qualities that had propelled his rise. His decisiveness, his willingness to act swiftly and harshly, and his intolerance of dissent had once been assets in the competitive underworld. Yet under sustained investigative pressure, those same qualities limited flexibility. Effective leadership in any organization, lawful or unlawful, requires adaptation to changing conditions. A rigid reliance on fear may succeed when threats are localized and predictable, but it becomes brittle when confronted with systemic challenges. As indictments accumulated and cooperating witnesses emerged, Casso's position grew precarious. The narrative of invincibility that once surrounded him began to crack. Authority in criminal organizations depends heavily on perception. If a leader appears vulnerable, confidence diminishes. The knowledge that law enforcement possessed detailed information eroded the sense of control that fear had maintained. Associates who once saw strength began to see risk. The atmosphere of suspicion intensified further, creating a feedback loop. Fear of betrayal led to harsher measures, which in turn increased resentment and anxiety. Ultimately, the structure he had helped build faced profound instability. Investigations were no longer distant possibilities. They were immediate realities. Legal proceedings threatened not only individual freedom, but also the coherence of the organization. In this environment, the limits of intimidation became clear. Courtrooms did not yield to reputation. Evidence and testimony carried more weight than whispers of violence. As legal pressure converged with internal distrust, the foundation of Casso's authority weakened significantly. His story during this period illustrates how criminal enterprises, though often portrayed as monolithic and unbreakable, are deeply vulnerable to shifts in trust and incentive. When loyalty is rooted primarily in fear, it can dissolve quickly under competing pressures. The climate that once enabled his dominance had transformed into one of exposure and fragility. While he had risen through a combination of strategic alliances and ruthless enforcement, maintaining that position required navigating a landscape that was rapidly changing. The escalation of investigations, the increasing prevalence of cooperation with authorities, and the cumulative effects of internal suspicion created a convergence of threats. In that convergence, the durability of fear-based leadership was tested severely. The power that once seemed secure was now contested not by open rivals on the street, but by sealed indictments and sworn testimony in court. As this phase unfolded, it became increasingly apparent that the methods that had secured control could not indefinitely shield it. The very intensity that had defined Anthony Gaspipe, Casso's leadership, now magnified his vulnerability. As the investigations tightened and the walls around Anthony Gaspipe, Casso began to close in. The mythology that had once surrounded his name started to erode under the weight of legal reality. For years, his authority had been reinforced by reputation, by stories of ruthless enforcement, and by the visible consequences faced by those who defied him. But in the end, reputation could not cross-examine witnesses, intimidate prosecutors, or dismantle evidence collected through months and years of patient surveillance. The structure that had elevated him now faced a reckoning, and the same climate of fear that once kept everyone in line began to fracture under pressure. Arrests and indictments disrupted the hierarchy that had once seemed so disciplined. Associates who had operated with confidence now confronted the possibility of spending the rest of their lives behind bars. In that moment, calculations changed. Loyalty rooted in intimidation began to compete with the instinct for survival. For a man who had relied so heavily on strict internal control, the emergence of cooperation agreements and detailed testimony represented a profound threat. The code of silence, once treated as sacred within organized crime circles, proved vulnerable when confronted with overwhelming legal leverage. As more information surfaced in courtrooms and investigative files, the narrative shifted from whispers in back rooms to public records. Allegations that had once circulated quietly became part of formal charges. Prosecutors outlined what they described as a pattern of ordered killings, conspiracy, and systematic enforcement designed to secure dominance within the Lucchese crime family. The portrait that emerged was not merely a participant in organized crime, but a leader who had embraced extreme measures to maintain authority. The very acts that once elevated him within his world now formed the backbone of the case against him. In this stage of his life, the dynamic of power reversed dramatically. The man who had once dictated outcomes found himself subject to decisions made by judges and juries. Control, which had been a defining feature of his leadership, was no longer in his hands. The psychological shift alone was immense. Leaders accustomed to commanding fear often struggle when placed in environments where fear carries no currency. Courtrooms operate on procedure and evidence, not intimidation. The climate of suspicion that had once helped him identify potential threats within his ranks now offered no protection against structured prosecution. As legal proceedings advanced, the broader implications of his rise and fall became increasingly clear. Criminal organizations thrive on perception. Strength must appear constant, loyalty must appear unwavering, and leadership must appear unassailable. When one of the most feared figures within a family becomes entangled in public legal battles, that perception weakens. Associates begin to question not only their leader's invincibility, but the stability of the entire structure. In Casso's case, the unraveling illustrated how a model built predominantly on fear can accelerate collapse once cracks appear. Those who had complied out of intimidation had little emotional incentive to defend him when circumstances changed. The bonds were transactional, not resilient. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies presented their cases methodically, relying on witness testimony, recorded conversations, and documentary evidence. The process was slow, deliberate, and relentless. Each new development chipped away at the aura that had once shielded him. The environment that had rewarded aggression offered no defense in the face of comprehensive prosecution. Over time, the image of the untouchable enforcer gave way to the reality of a defendant navigating the justice system. His downfall did not occur in a single dramatic moment, but unfolded gradually, shaped by accumulated pressure, internal mistrust, external investigations, and the structural evolution of federal prosecution all converged. The same paranoia that had once been a tool for maintaining discipline now seemed to reflect a deeper instability. When leaders view everyone as a potential traitor, they often create the very isolation that weakens them. As alliances deteriorated and trust evaporated, the organization's cohesion suffered. In examining the final chapter of Anthony Gaspipe, Casso's trajectory, it becomes evident that his story is less about a sudden reversal and more about the long-term consequences of sustained ruthlessness. Violence can secure territory, silence dissent, and establish hierarchy, but it also generates attention, resentment, and vulnerability. Every act of intimidation narrows the path forward, limiting flexibility and increasing risk. For a time, Casso's strategy achieved its immediate goals. He rose through the ranks, solidified influence, and commanded obedience. Yet the cost of that ascent accumulated quietly in the background. By the time legal pressure reached its peak, the support structure around him had thinned. Fear does not inspire sacrifice. It enforces compliance until a stronger force intervenes. The justice system, with its capacity for lengthy sentences and negotiated cooperation, proved to be that stronger force. Ultimately, his fall illustrated a broader truth about organized crime leadership. Power obtained through extreme enforcement can appear formidable, but often lacks durability. Stability within any complex organization depends on a balance between authority and trust. When fear dominates entirely, the system becomes brittle. Under sufficient stress, brittleness leads to fracture. The Lucchese crime family, like other criminal enterprises of its era, faced a transformed legal landscape. Enhanced investigative techniques, coordinated prosecutions, and the strategic use of insider testimony altered the balance of power. Leaders who failed to adapt found themselves increasingly exposed. Casso's reliance on intimidation was effective in an earlier context, but it proved unsustainable in a world where legal scrutiny intensified and incentives shifted. As his legal battles progressed and the narrative of his activities became part of public record, the mystique that once surrounded him diminished. The story that had once been told in hushed tones among associates became a case study in the vulnerabilities of fear-based leadership. The cycle of power, violence, and paranoia that defined his rise ultimately contributed to his isolation. In the end, he faced the consequences within a system immune to the tactics that had once secured his dominance. His life serves as a stark example of how criminal empires can be both powerful and fragile. The same method that elevates individuals to positions of control can accelerate their downfall when circumstances change. For observers, the arc of this story underscores the self-destructive potential embedded in environments governed by intimidation. When every relationship is conditioned by fear, loyalty becomes temporary and conditional. When suspicion overrides cooperation, unity dissolves. And when external forces apply sustained pressure, structures built on coercion struggle to withstand it. Anthony Gaspipe, Casso's trajectory from feared enforcer to fallen figure, encapsulates the dangerous cycle at the heart of organized crime. His rise was fueled by decisiveness, strategic alignment, and alleged violence designed to secure authority. His reign was characterized by strict control, an atmosphere where dissent carried severe consequences. His fall was shaped by intensifying investigations, internal mistrust, and the gradual erosion of the very fear that had once protected him. In the final analysis, his story reveals that dominance achieved through intimidation often contains the seeds of its own undoing. The climate of fear that once strengthened his position ultimately weakened the bonds necessary for long-term survival. As the legal system asserted authority and alliances crumbled, the image of the ruthless enforcer gave way to the reality of a man overtaken by the consequences of his methods. The narrative stands as a reminder that in the shadowed world of organized crime, power is rarely permanent, and the forces that elevate individuals can just as easily dismantle them. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.